Between the joy of Palm Sunday and the shadow of the Passion, Holy Monday lingered like a breath held too long. Most believers passed through it without notice, treating it as a simple continuation of the previous day's triumph. Churches remained open, candles were lit, and prayers continued. But the atmosphere shifted in ways that few could name. It was not a day of loud betrayal or visible suffering, but of unseen movement beneath the surface. In monasteries and quiet chapels, older religious texts referred to it not as a celebration, but as a threshold, an invisible gate into the sorrow of the weak. While the faithful remembered Christ's entrance into Jerusalem with palms and prepared their hearts for the coming crucifixion, Holy Monday existed in between, neither glory nor grief. And yet, for some mystics and saints, it held a particular weight. It was the day when intentions began to unravel. The hosannas of the crowd, still echoing in the air, began to thin and break. The first whispers of betrayal took root, and unseen forces moved silently through hearts, testing their resolve. According to some forgotten writings, it was the day when Judas first conceived his betrayal, though he spoke nothing aloud. His face remained unchanged, but something within him had shifted. And with that internal shift, the spiritual balance tilted. Sister Lucia of Fatima would later write in a private letter that Holy Monday was the quiet turning of the tide. She did not elaborate publicly, but those close to her remembered how she approached that day with more stillness than even Good Friday. For her, it was not about what was done, but what was allowed to begin. She warned that prayers said thoughtlessly on this day could echo strangely in the spiritual realm because the air itself was different, charged, expectant, and easily disturbed. The veil between the visible and the invisible did not tear, but it rippled. In many homes, Holy Monday felt like any other Lenten weekday, yet small signs began to emerge. Miscommunications that caused wounds, prayers that felt hollow, emotions that turned unexpectedly heavy. Some chalked it up to tiredness, others to coincidence. But in ancient monastic writings, there were traces of understanding. One monk wrote that this day was the silent descent, where the soul must choose whether to walk deeper into the mystery or retreat into distraction. It was a day that tested inner foundations, not with fire, but with silence. The Church, in its liturgical rhythm, did not ignore the day, but it gave it little weight. And so it slipped quietly by, year after year. But some remembered, and some, like Lucia, whispered of a warning not often heeded. Because it was precisely on the days no one watches that spiritual tides change, and it was on Holy Monday, in the stillness between palm branches and thorns, that something dark always began to move. The letter was never meant for the public. Written in careful, slanted handwriting on aged parchment, it had been sealed with a simple red mark and tucked into the folds of an old breviary belonging to a now silent Carmelite nun. For decades it remained untouched, stored among other relics in a wooden chest at the back of a monastic library. When it was finally discovered, dust clung to its edges like the weight of time itself. Those who read it expected pious reflections or forgotten devotions. What they found instead was a warning. The message bore the signature of Sister Lucia of Fatima and was dated during the final years of her life, long after her last public appearance. Its content was neither grand nor sensational, but striking. in its precision. She wrote of a particular day, Holy Monday, a day she called a crack in the rhythm of salvation. The phrase was odd, poetic in tone, but what followed made the readers pause. She described how during one particular Holy Monday decades earlier, she had experienced a spiritual inversion, where her usual prayers seemed to fall inward rather than ascend. She explained that some days, due to the weight of spiritual history, required not just reverence but restraint. Lucia warned of a kind of prayer that, though well-intentioned, could open doors better left shut. She did not specify the words, but pointed instead to the heart's posture, stating that agitation, pride, or curiosity could taint a holy intention on that day. She recalled a vision in which a veil hung across the sanctuary of the world, thinner than usual, trembling with pressure from both sides. Her role, she believed, was not to interpret it, but to testify. The letter urged those who found it to pass the knowledge quietly, without drama or sensationalism, because the truth it carried was subtle. It was a whisper against noise, a call to humility in a world addicted to speaking. After its discovery, the letter was shown to a small circle of clergy and contemplatives. Most agreed it was authentic, though some felt it was merely personal and not to be taken as directive. Yet others felt something stir in their memory. They recalled old stories of monks who kept silence on Holy Monday, or of saints who retreated into deeper solitude as the Passion approached. Some began to piece together scattered traditions, finding consistency in Lucia's words. The Church never issued a statement, but within hidden corners of spiritual life, the message began to ripple. It was not the kind of prophecy that shouted. It did not predict disaster or call for revolution. It asked for awareness. It asked for stillness. And it reminded those who prayed that even sacred practices must be guided by discernment. The past, Lucia wrote, is never past. It waits in moments like these, waiting for the attentive soul to remember what most have forgotten. And Holy Monday, though almost erased from collective memory, remained such a moment. Hidden, but heavy with meaning. It began with something so small that no one noticed. A priest in a quiet village chapel prepared for Holy Week as he always had, arranging candles, folding vestments, and placing prayer cards along the pews. On Holy Monday, he decided to add a new devotional, an old Latin prayer found in the margins of a 19th century missal. It seemed harmless, reverent, even beautiful. He shared it with a few parishioners, encouraging them to recite it after Mass, believing it would help them reflect more deeply on the suffering of Christ. That evening, one woman who had prayed, it complained of a sudden migraine and a deep restlessness that did not lift even after hours of silence. Another said her dreams had turned oppressive, filled with shadows and whispered voices that made no sense but lingered long after she woke. The priest dismissed the complaints at first, thinking they were the effects of fasting or stress. But then something changed in the chapel itself. On Tuesday morning, the altar candles wouldn't stay lit. Each time they were ignited, the flames flickered wildly, then died as if snuffed by invisible breath. The air in the sanctuary grew heavy, and a few parishioners described it as pressurized, as if something unseen had entered. One of the altar servers, a teenager known for his composure, froze midway through preparing the incense and refused to return to the sacristy without being accompanied. He later admitted he felt as though someone had been watching him from the darkness behind the choir loft. The priest, unnerved, revisited the prayer he had found. Upon closer inspection, he realized it bore symbols unfamiliar to traditional Catholic liturgy, subtle signs woven into the Latin, odd spacing, and an invocation that echoed a phrase he could not trace to any approved source. He began to wonder if the prayer had originated not from a place of devotion, but from a misguided or corrupted source. He burned the page and removed every copy from the church, but the atmosphere did not lift. By Wednesday, the complaints had grown. People described a sense of disorientation during prayer, as if their words fell into a void. One elderly woman, a daily communicant, refused to enter the chapel, saying it felt wrong. Another man, a skeptic who rarely spoke of spiritual matters, confided that something in the church had shifted, that peace had vanished. The priest contacted a fellow cleric, who recalled an old mention of a similar experience decades prior. It had also begun on Holy Monday. The following night, the priest dreamt of Lucia, not as he had seen her in photos, but as an aged figure standing beside a flame that would not light. In the dream, she said nothing. She only pointed to the altar, and then placed a finger to her lips. He woke in the dark, heart pounding, and knew something had gone terribly wrong. In his heart, he remembered what he had dismissed before. The letter, the warning, the fragile veil Lucia had described. He had torn it, or at least thinned it further. By praying without discernment, he had turned the sacred into a tool for something he did not understand. The chapel remained physically intact, but spiritually dimmed. From that moment forward, he vowed never again to introduce prayer without deep discernment, especially not on Holy Monday. Because sometimes it is not the absence of prayer that causes harm. It is the wrong one, said at the wrong time in a place that listens too closely. The signs were never loud. They came quietly, like a draft in a sealed room, or the faint sound of something moving just beyond the edge of perception. For those attuned to the spiritual atmosphere of a sacred space, the difference was immediate. The prayers were still being said, the candles still lit, the incense still rising, but something was off. And those who listened with the heart began to notice three subtle but unmistakable signs that the prayers offered on that Holy Monday had taken on a distorted resonance. The first sign was an unnatural heaviness, not physical fatigue or emotional sorrow, which were expected during the Passion Week, but a spiritual weight that settled in the air during prayer. Those who normally felt uplifted by sacred words began to feel as if they were speaking into a void. The words did not rise, they collapsed inward. Even the most devout experienced sudden, unexplained fatigue when trying to pray aloud. Their minds would wander more than usual, and a pressure built in the chest. Not panic, but a dull constriction. The silence after prayer felt colder than before it began. The second sign was inversion. This was the most disturbing and the least understood. Those who repeated the distorted prayer began to sense that its effects were reversed. Instead of bringing peace, it stirred anxiety. Instead of clarity, confusion. Some described feeling emotionally agitated for no reason, as though their own thoughts turned against them. Others noticed a strange echo in their inner prayer life, as if something were repeating their words back to them, slightly altered in a way they could not articulate. It was not an audible voice, but a mirrored presence, distorting reflection rather than offering light. Priests who heard confessions on that day remarked on an unusual restlessness, as if souls were grappling with unseen tensions beyond their own sins. The third sign was silence. Not the holy kind, but a vacant one. The sacred spaces that usually hummed with invisible presence felt abandoned. The sanctuary no longer carried the warm stillness that invited contemplation. It became sterile. Even the candles seemed to flicker without rhythm, casting shadows that didn't match the architecture. Some described it as a prayerful disconnection, where their intention remained, but their spirit felt unable to move. The grace that normally poured quietly into the soul during moments of surrender seemed delayed, distant, or simply absent. Those three signs, spiritual weight, inversion of peace, and sterile silence, became the pattern. Wherever the improper prayer had been introduced, these markers followed. Some clergy tried to dismiss it as psychological, but the repetition across locations and testimonies began to paint a different picture. A monk in a distant cloister, unaware of the village events, recorded nearly identical experiences in his journal that year. He noted how a certain prayer echoed strangely on Holy Monday, and how after saying it, he had been overcome with a sense that God was listening, but not answering. Sister Lucia's letter, when revisited in this context, suddenly made more sense. She had not called prayer itself dangerous, but warned that some days carried a fragile spiritual fabric that could be torn by zeal without wisdom. Holy Monday, it seemed, was one such day. And the distortion didn't arise from blasphemy or heresy, but from misalignment, praying with the wrong tone, the wrong intention, or in imitation of something not fully understood. The Church has always taught that prayer is powerful, but power, even when born of faith, must be guided. On most days, a misplaced phrase or overzealous emotion might pass unnoticed. But on days when the veil is thin, when betrayal stirs beneath the surface, when heaven watches in silence, then every word matters. And the signs of misalignment, though subtle, are never without consequence. When the voices of the world turned quiet and the rituals of Holy Week flowed forward with practiced familiarity, there was one who did not forget. The silence buried within Holy Monday. Sister Lucia, though enclosed in the quiet of her Carmelite convent, carried within her a burden that had grown heavier with age. Her body had become frail, her eyesight dim, but her spirit remained alert, watching the invisible movements within the Church and within time itself. She had long understood that not every silence was peaceful, and not every prayer was heard rightly. Some silences, she believed, were filled with warnings too soft for the ear, but too heavy for the soul to ignore. In her later years, when asked to write final reflections for the archives of the Carmel, Lucia included a sealed folder labeled simply Segunda-feira Santa, Holy Monday. Within it were a series of fragmented observations, visions, and warnings, not doctrinal, but mystical. She spoke of the strange spiritual atmosphere that hovered on that day each year, not evil exactly, but unstable. A day that trembled beneath the weight of what had not yet happened. It was, she wrote, like the moment in Gethsemane when the disciples slept while eternity pressed in around them, a day when the Church unknowingly repeated that slumber, lulled by routine and neglect. Lucia recounted one particular vision, one that had returned to her more than once throughout her life. In it, she saw a vast plain cloaked in mist and scattered. Across it were flickers of light, small prayers rising from souls across the earth. Most of them vanished quickly like sparks extinguished before they could reach the sky. But a few rose slowly, deliberately, glowing with sincerity. These were met by a great silence, not rejection, but something closer to sorrow. Then from the center of the plain, a darker light began to form. It took the shape of words, prayers, that mimicked holiness, that sounded devout, but were hollow or distorted by pride, fear, or confusion. These did not rise, they spread outward, rippling through the mist and dimming the true lights nearby. Lucia never claimed these visions as prophecy. She offered them with humility, stating they were given not for fear, but for discernment. Yet, she urged those who read her words to approach Holy Monday not with indifference, but with care. She warned against hasty devotions, emotionally charged prayers, or innovations that had not been tested by time and truth. She believed that on this one day, more than others, heaven asked for silence rather than noise, for contemplation rather than action, for listening rather than speaking. She remembered a time in her youth when she had once tried to impose her own desires on God in prayer, reciting a long litany of needs and expectations. That night, she had a dream in which the Virgin appeared, not with words, but with a single gesture, placing her hand gently over Lucia's mouth. It was a correction, not of intention, but of timing. Since then, Lucia had learned that even sacred things could become misaligned when offered at the wrong moment or in the wrong spirit. As the world continued to rush forward, embracing faster devotions and louder declarations of faith, Lucia remained anchored in the stillness she had come to cherish. She believed that the great danger of the modern soul was not abandonment of God, but the cluttering of prayer with so much noise that God could no longer be heard. Holy Monday, she said, had become a forgotten gate, narrow, quiet, but essential. If entered without care, it led nowhere. But if approached with humility, it opened something profound. Toward the end of her writings, she penned a single paragraph that stood out from the rest. It was almost a plea. On Holy Monday, she wrote, say nothing unless the silence leads you. Do not reach toward heaven with anxious hands. Instead, let your heart kneel before the mystery that waits. There are prayers too sacred for the tongue. Wait for them. When those words were eventually discovered, they were shown to a small circle of theologians. Some dismissed them as private mysticism. Others saw in them a reflection of the forgotten wisdom that the Church had once held close, the belief that timing, posture, and intention mattered deeply in prayer. But for a few, Lucia's message felt like a key, small, quiet, unassuming, but capable of unlocking a door few remembered. While the world observed Holy Monday with little notice, and most prayers passed through it unaware, Lucia's voice remained. It echoed not in sermons or public proclamations, but in the sacred stillness of those who dared to listen. And in that stillness, she reminded the faithful of what few dared to say. Not all prayers are safe, not all days are equal, and sometimes the holiest act is to wait in silence, guarding the space where the divine is still deciding how to speak.